Hello, friends, and welcome back to our Secular Buddhist Essentials program. My name is Venerable Tarpa. We're almost finishing up the first part of our text, and it's very exciting indeed. Um, and of course, the first part is on introduction, adaptation, history of Buddhism. We've gotten kind of out of history today, and last week, today, and next week. We're talking about the modern traditions of Buddhism as we know it. Last week we talked about the Theravada tradition, and today we're going to dig into the Tibetan tradition. So, with that said, how about if I just share with you? We'll start with the textbook presentation of Tibetan Buddhism, and then we can get into all your questions because, oh, I know so much about this subject. Um, so, as outside invaders ravaged India around the 11th century, almost eradicating Buddhism from its homeland, many Indian Buddhist masters escaped into the Himalayas where the Buddha's teachings could be protected and remain safe. The safest of regions was, of course, in the high Tibetan plateau protected by the vast Himalayan mountain range. Because of this, Tibet and the Himalayas became the world's greatest repository of later Indian Buddhism recorded in Sanskrit. Although Buddhist texts had started arriving in Tibet from both India and China as early as the 6th and 7th century, it wasn't until the 8th century that Buddhism became the official religion of Tibet. Based on the Indian Vajrayana vehicle, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, um, which serves as its foundation, Tibetan Buddhism was additionally influenced by Chinese Chan Buddhism and its indigenous Bon religion. Um, Being a form of Indian Vajrayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism is therefore a branch of the Mahayana. It accepts the Nikaya, Mahayana, and Vajrayana scriptures as authentic teachings of the Buddha and taught by the Buddha. These teachings, translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan, comprise the Tibetan Buddhist canon, which is called the Kangyor and the Tengyor. Tibetan Buddhism focuses on the accumulation of wisdom and merit through study, contemplation, meditation, mindfulness, ritual, chanting, mantra recitation, and good works. However, the most obvious thing that sets Tibetan Buddhism apart from other Buddhist traditions is its practice of Tantra, or Vajrayana Buddhism. Tantra is a secret esoteric teaching and practice found in all Indian religions, including Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. The practice of Tantra includes harnessing psychophysical energies through meditation, ritual, and visualization, all with the aim of developing and purifying the mind, leading to the supreme aim of attaining Buddhahood. So that's the textbook presentation I have, and that's about all I'm going to talk about in the text itself. If anybody wants a deep dive into it, the in the in my Tibetan Buddhist Essentials text, Volume 1, there's a really intense presentation of Tibetan Buddhism. Talks about the Dalai Lama, talks about philosophical traditions, and I think it's quite good. I'll post a link for that in our chat groups if you want to read more about it. In our Secular Buddhist Essentials program, I don't think we need such a deep dive. So, if we think about the Nikaya, well, with modern traditions, if we think about the Vajrayana, or try that again, if we think about the Theravada as being the closest to the Nikayas, or what many would say are possibly the most authentic of the Buddhist teachings, then Tibetan Buddhism would probably be the farthest away, even though those texts are in there, right? So, like when we talk about the Theravada tradition, the Pali Canon, if we compare it to Christianity, it's similar to like Old Testament and New Testament. Like Judaism follows more of an Old Testament Torah presentation, but for Christians, the teachings of Jesus are built upon that. So the Old Testament is there within all the schools. It's the same with Buddhism. The Pali tradition, the Pali Canon, that information primarily is in all the canons. So and nowadays there's three authentic canons. There's the Pali Canon, the Tibetan Canon, and the Chinese Canon. And so each one of them is based on like the Pali Canon, but then there's more added to them, right? The Chinese Canon has the Mahayana scriptures on top of that, and then Tibetan Vajrayana has the Tantric teachings on top of that. So you can imagine the Tibetan tradition has the most array of teachings. Also, the Tibetans believe that they're the only tradition that comprises of the Buddha's full spectrum of teachings. They believe the Buddha within his lifetime taught all three vehicles, right? The Nikaya, the Mahayana, the Vajrayana, and different teachings to different levels of students. And so they believe it's the pinnacle of Buddhism in the world. It comprises all of the teachings. And as you can imagine, like the Theravada, they feel the opposite, that these are all additional things that actually weren't taught by the Buddha. And so you're moving further and further away from the Buddha's teachings. I think that they're all extraordinary. You know, instead of sitting here and saying which ones I think are authentic or not, I think it's a lot safer to say that they're all just extraordinary in their own way. And I kind of reject the idea that anything that wasn't explicitly taught by the Buddha is rejected. You know, if that's the case, doesn't that make the Buddhist tradition pretty lame? That only the Buddha we can follow? Like, well, what about all the great masters throughout history? You know, they don't have anything to share to it. Like for Mahayana, it's the work of Nagarjuna. So the Theravada, who actually, they embody a little bit of Nagarjuna's work, but to reject Nagarjuna because he wasn't a Buddha, but what an extraordinary practitioner and master he was, right? And it's the same when we get into Vajrayana, the work of Tsongkhapa, and all of the Landa masters like Atisha. And another thing that's interesting about Tibetan Buddhism, as the Dalai Lama says, that Tibetan Buddhism is the Buddhism of Nalanda University. And so that means that Tibetan Buddhism is influenced by the later Indian Buddhism of the time. So as we talked about before in a timeline, that Buddhism traveled to the east, to China and Japan, much earlier. So they had an early version of Buddhism, right? Between the 1st and 5th, 6th century. And so most countries where Buddhism was exported to, it kind of froze in time in those places. But Buddhism in India kept evolving. And that's where the Vajrayana comes in, right? So this later age, and especially of these Nalanda masters, of Atisha and Shantideva, their work was only preserved in Tibetan Buddhism, right? It was almost completely eradicated in India. So now whether you think that this is a more evolved form of Buddhism that India went to or a more diluted form, that's a question we all have to ask ourselves. But the Dalai Lama continuously says that Tibetan Buddhism is the Buddhism of Nalanda University. I would like to add a caveat to that, and that it's clear in the history of Tibet that, especially at the beginning, Tibet was heavily influenced by Chan Buddhism. In fact, Chinese Buddhism is the first to arrive in in Tibet. Hey, they got a really interesting thing. Let's see if I remember the Samya debates. I think I remember that. So and you think about debates, like they would happen over a weekend and you'd attend, but no, this is more like 2 years that the Tibetans had these great masters debate each other. Indian masters and Chinese masters debate each other in Tibet. And then after about 2 years, the Tibetans decided who wins the debates. And they decided the country wanted to go with Indian Buddhism. So they chose that. They expelled the Chinese masters. And then from that point on, in and around the 8th century, Tibet becomes Indian Buddhism. But again, with that said, Tibetan Buddhism is heavily influenced by their indigenous religion, the Bon religion. It's spelled B-O-N with the funny dots above the O, the Bon religion. So Bon religion was shamanistic. Remember we talked about a while back that everywhere that Buddhism travels to, even in modern times, there's always an underlying shamanistic, indigenous religious practice that's still there. In Sri Lanka, it was very heavy. Everywhere you go, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand. Now, the Buddhist monks aren't really invested in it, but the lay people are heavily. Of course, Japanese Shinto is very, very strong, and many would argue in India, Tantra is actually that shamanistic, animistic kind of practice. So the Bon religion is very strongly influences Tibetan Buddhism as well, and in a couple of things, one of them is a much stronger emphasis on spirits and Dharma protectors and things like that. A much stronger emphasis on the bardo, or in-between state between this life and the next life. So you can really see in there that there's a huge impact that the Bon religion still has in Buddhism there. And I think it just continuously evolved. Some of the things in Buddhist history that are interesting, they had a Buddhist king, and who was against Buddhism. He favored the Bon religion, and he tries in his lifetime to completely eradicate Buddhism in Tibet. And at the time, Buddhism is the Nyingma tradition, the early Dzogchen tradition, and he does a pretty good job of doing it. But he's assassinated by people that believe in the other kind of Buddhism. So isn't that interesting? A little Buddhist assassination. And Buddhism comes back, but the problem is that the Buddhism had become so diluted and polluted that Indian masters again had to come from India to bring back proper Buddhism to Tibet. This happens on a couple occasions with great leaders, especially Atisha, who comes in, begins the Kadampa tradition, which turns in the Gelug tradition. And so Tibet is a fascinating history in its evolution of Buddhism. Hey, any questions out there? I don't know what else you want to know. They all wear red. How about that? Kat?
I just what you said about about people that just reject teachings by the great masters. They say Tsongkhapa. Like, why would we do that? Just because it might not be the words of the Buddha, because he still obviously had so much insight. So that was very interesting.
Yeah, why do Christians reject the Mormons? This happens in all religions, and not just religion, psychology, philosophy. I'm sorry. Look at philosophy out there. Everybody's in different camps and religions. It's human nature, right? Tsongkhapa is one of my favorite Buddhist philosophers. He was really brilliant, so rational. Some philosophers you follow, and oftentimes they kind of get off topic, or you see mistakes are being made. Tsongkhapa just seems the always be perfect in his rationale. You never read it and then all of a sudden he takes a funny left turn and you go, no, that wasn't quite right. He's just brilliant, yeah. And of course, I'm trying to think of what else would be interesting to talk about. So, as China invades Tibet, which we talked about before, and we talked about reasons why that happened. I'd like to not do that again, but it is in the text that I'm recommending everybody to read, Tibetan Buddhist Essentials. But as the Chinese invaded and the Dalai Lama and thousands of Tibetans have to leave Tibet, which is a sad thing indeed, but it does usher in a benefit for the rest of us. It brings Buddhism out into the world. Before that, Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, was very hidden, very secret. Tibetans did not like outsiders. There were severe penalties for anyone who helped foreigners to come into Tibet, including having their hands chopped off. The movie 7 Years in Tibet with Brad Pitt is an excellent movie that talks a lot about that. Kundun is another excellent movie by Martin Scorsese that is extraordinary for learning more about that. I think it's safe to say that Tibetan Buddhism is the most religious, mystical of all forms of Buddhism. Not everybody practices Tantra. Some people decide to practice in more of a sutra way, like I did. Any thoughts or questions? I'm trying to think of interesting things to tell you about Tibetan Buddhism. Ethan.
Sure. I had a question. So uniquely, I think, I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I think one thing that makes Tibet unique is that the form of Buddhism there wasn't just like the local religion. It eventually, I guess it was like essentially the form of government of Tibet. And I was wondering, so, you know, Buddhism in Japan and China never really reached the level of having governmental control compared to Tibet. And I wondered about the history of that, or what kind of insight you have in that regard.
Yeah, so the Burn religion isn't Buddhist or wasn't Buddhist at the time. It was uh, it was an indigenous local religion, shamanistic. And then but as Buddhism took over, the Burn slowly evolved into a kind of Buddhist practice. Um, Even now, when you see the Burn religion is still alive, but it is, I think that they consider themselves Buddhists. Their robes are almost identical, except there were some blue patches on their vests, so you can tell they're Burn. They did end up with some really wild ideas, like they believe that Buddhism came to Tibet 14,000, 18,000 years ago. And so, yeah, they did adapt some very strange historical stories about their origins, but you can still find them there, and it's basically the same as traditional Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism. And then, as far as the government stuff goes, what happened was that the Buddhism had become, I mean, from a Buddhist standpoint, the best thing that could have been expected happened. The country turned into a completely pure Buddhist country where every single thing in people's lives revolved around the Dharma, everything. And so it clearly just took over. I think probably governments and things, they just respected the lamas as being people of much greater insight and just let them kind of take over. But in Tibet, any higher learning was done by monastics and mostly male. So the idea, if you wanted to be a doctor, a politician, a writer, a mathematician, scientist, anything, having to do with higher education, you had to be a monastic to do so. So in Tibet, vocations were pretty small. You had a lot of monks, probably 30% of the population were monastics, monks and nuns. Then you had farmers, and that are growing sampa and barley. You had the herdsmen that are herding yak. You had shopkeepers. You had miscellaneous things like there was still a place for shamanistic people that did weddings and things like that. So that was kind of the population. But then, yeah, Tibet became a purely religious state. But I think maybe sometimes we see that and we think about terrorism and Islamicism taking over countries, and not being such a beneficial thing. But I think the Tibets did a pretty good job of it. Maybe because Buddhism is so nonviolent and passive. But a lot of people complain that it did turn into a source of obsession where the monks kind of lived like kings and lords over the land, and peasants were more like just peasants, farming and things like that. But I always argued that, and I've been there many times. I've been to Tibet 4 or 5 times. I've lived throughout the Himalayas, and anyone you ask, if they had their choice, they would go back to the way things were. So as much as I think the Chinese like to paint that picture that they were rescuing simple people from some kind of oppression by the greedy monastics, I don't believe that was true for a second. I do believe corruption was there and greed, which it always is, but they really did strike a really beautiful balance. I think the lay people were very happy to supply the monastics with what they needed. And remember that every family had family members in the monasteries. So it wasn't this kind of very clean divide. The monastery was the center of town. Everything revolved around it. And a great deal of people that you knew and loved were members of it. Oh, that was a long answer. Was that okay, Namdak? Oh, Miss Wangmo.
So, can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah.
And you may have answered this in Tibetan tradition, so if you did, just tell me. But I haven't finished it yet.
Are you going to get me in trouble?
I don't know. I don't think so. Um, so being in the Gaelic tradition and being absorbed in all that, and then you said you don't have to follow the tantric path. What made you decide that that wasn't the path you wanted to follow anymore?
So it's kind of funny. Buddhism in all its forms always comes around to saying that you don't have to believe in anything, and everybody needs to investigate what it is. And then even in the debate grounds, you're told to explore these topics and you're free to think what you want. But at the end of the day, when you go back to the teacher, you're really supposed to find their answers are true. So as much as you try to have this style or approach of openness, there still is the idea of what's right thinking, what's wrong thinking. I don't think that had anything to do with what you just asked me. But for me, it was just investigation. When I first entered Tibetan Buddhism, I was all about all the magic and esoteric teachings, and I bought all my bells and whistles and tankas, and I had all the implements for my desk. I was a tantrika. And then slowly, as I practiced what we called the path of reason, that was our path of learning how to. It's really critical thinking, learning to be more logical, more rational. Just more and more of it didn't seem to agree with me, didn't seem to agree with the way I see the world. And so I often talk about that it was kind of a path of continuously having my heart broken, that all the things that I believed in or wanted to believe were real. I just kind of kept finding them to be dead ends. This doesn't have anything to do with my opinion of the tradition. I think it's a very, very powerful path. I think it's a resultant path. I think they can deliver what they promise. But I also think very few people can reach those levels. It doesn't seem like it's a path that is appealing to a wide group of people. It takes an extraordinary amount of dedication to follow the tantric path. It is so complex, and so. But for myself, I found that the more of a simpler approach that I followed, it was more beneficial to me. I seem to get results more from it. Meaning, I seem to awaken more when I simplified things. We just went back to a good, straightforward meditation practice, practicing kindness, practicing these types of things. So I found what worked for me. So it wasn't that I ever had to end up with a decision of what I thought of that. It wasn't right for me. And I wasn't prepared to put that kind of energy into something that I wasn't that sure about to begin with. Yeah. And remember, I traveled to the most obscure little monasteries in the Himalayas and studied with masters there. I studied all the big famous monasteries. I toured the Potala Palace, room tech for where the Karmapa was. I studied all the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. So, and in my book I talk about that. I did it so everybody else doesn't have to. I did it and I could come back and report it to everybody. But if you like Tibetan Buddhism, I give it a big thumbs up. But I wasn't prepared for that level of dedication, and I just simply wasn't sure if it would pay off in the end. Padma, would you like to share?
Yeah, just a quick question. I was just wondering if you could talk to us about where Tibetans in exile are today, and whether there's any Tibetan Buddhism actually in Tibet left. Is there a strand still there, or is it been completely exiled? Is it all now in India? Yeah.
Primarily, the great Buddhism is now in India. Last time I was in Tibet, there was a real problem where the Chinese were telling the monasteries what to do, and in most cases they were making the monks do puja all day long for tourists. But a puja means like a mass, a ritual, but empty, and nobody really knowing what was behind it. The Tibetans more and more are looking for these masters to go back to Tibet from India after getting a good education here. One of my dear teachers did so, Pema Choling, and he went. His name was Dachamba. He went back, and he's an abbot of a monastery now. It appears he's doing some really good work. But you have the right idea. They really damaged Tibetan Buddhism. But all the great masters left in exile to keep it pure in India. So yeah, the great monasteries are now in India. Oh, Sampo, please.
Yeah, I think you had touched upon it earlier when you said about China seeing itself as freeing up or freeing Tibet from the corruption and from the sort of hierarchy that were treating people like peasants. I had a colleague, someone in my team, a couple of years ago who's Chinese, and I had a book on Dalai Lama on my desk, and I was actually taken aback because I seen a side of her which I hadn't seen, and that was the total hatred that she had for the Dalai Lama,
Yeah.
and venomous hatred towards him, and then coming out with, just as you said, that historical aspect of we freeing Tibet from the peasants and such like, and then I reminded her and said a very small percentage of Chinese people are wealthy. Then you have other people that are just surviving. Then you have mass millions who are slaves and peasants. I say so. didn't succeed in freeing your own people. Never
And that's
mind,
the communist
Tibet.
line, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
The
Yeah,
communist line is that they're freeing all regular people in the world, common people,
yeah,
and so they tried to use the same line in Tibet,
yeah.
but I think it was clearly not true.
No. Mm,
When I traveled China, I had a lot of that. When I
yeah,
mentioned I was a student of the Dalai Lama, people in hotels and places actually become angry. And what
mhm,
does he teach? Why are you following? What is I said? Well, he teaches kindness and compassion. And then they
mhm.
kind of look at you like they'd never heard it before.
Yeah, I had that as well. I did say that as well, funnily
Thank you,
enough.
Sample.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, Tim, please.
Yeah, I saw in the news recently, I guess the Dalai Lama was waiting until his 90th birthday to sort of make a statement about his future successor, and which was just recently. And if I recall, I think he said that his successor either would or could come from outside of Tibet, I guess. Um, has that ever happened before, or have all the Dalai Lamas traditionally always been from Tibet?
Well, they've never had one born outside because they've never the Chinese takeover happened during this Dalai Lama's.
Sure.
But the Dalai Lama commenting on this has been going on for years and years and years. I remember reading about it when I first got into Buddhism 30 years ago. So he's talked about being born a woman, a Westerner, many
Mhm.
things like that. I've heard him say no, he wants to be reborn in Tibet. So there's nothing new there. It's just the weirdest thing is the Chinese claiming they're going to do it, and they're going to do it before he dies. So like somebody has to tell them that's not the way it works. You have to the person has to die before they can be reborn. But and of course it takes years too because when they die they have to you can't recognize the child until at least 4. So there's 4 years between them that happens. And then there's a lot of discussion of whether the idea of reincarnate lamas is actually a real thing or not. Even the Dalai Lama seems to have different views on that. In teachings on numerous occasions, he claimed before thousands of people that he wasn't the 14th Dalai Lama, he wasn't the reincarnation, but he said he does feel a karmic connection with the past. And then my Tibetan friends all said, no, he's just being humble. He doesn't mean it. So there's, yeah, hard to make sense of what all that is. David, please.
This is just a follow-up question to Nathan's question. Have you any idea why it is that what was it in Tibet that allowed Buddhism to become completely all-encompassing, the government, everything else? What were the unique features that allowed that to happen in Tibet when it never happened anywhere else? Have you any idea?
I understand the question. To be honest, that's a good question that I've never really pondered, and I don't believe I've been asked before. Probably, if I was to guess, just the isolation. That there wasn't there's nothing else around. It's just them. It's an insular society, and so it seems like that would, and the fact that it's a religion and a very mystical kind of religion. Tibetans were really, really superstitious. They saw, according to the early texts, they saw demons behind every rock and believed in spirits and everything else. And so they turned their Buddhism into that highly mystical, spiritual kind of practice. So I think like a lot of isolated places where ideologies can just flourish like that. I think that's probably the best answer.
Thanks. Makes sense.
Miss Wamba?
I was just gonna say, would you agree that they're not going to allow the reincarnation to happen in Tibet because of that other young reincarnation that the Chinese government kidnapped?
The
And
Panchen
then
Lama.
yeah, so I think that because of the fear of that happening again is the reason, because he did just announce that it will probably, the next reincarnation will probably be born in India.
Yeah, and
Um,
then the Chinese will clearly pick their own as well,
they
and we'll
will,
see how
yeah.
that unfolds. You could see for invading force, what a unique thing that the whole religion is riding on this single event, right? And if you could capture that to your will, you can take over the spirituality of the whole country. And as we know in history, religion and spirituality is a much better way to control the masses than nationalism, like Romans did with Christianity. And so the Panchen Lama and the Dalai Lama are two sides to a coin. They complement each other. When the Dalai Lama is young, the Panchen Lama runs the country, and when the Dalai Lama comes into power, the Panchen Lama is old. When he dies, the Dalai Lama finds the next Panchen Lama. When the Dalai Lama dies, the Panchen Lama finds the next Dalai Lama. And so they have the same thing in a couple other schools, like the Kaju have the same thing going on in with their reincarnated masters. So yeah, Sampo, please.
So I'm trying to get my head around this. So if China decides that they are going to pick the next Dalai Lama, which we know they are going to do, how does this actually work? Is it who recognizes the true Dalai Lama, or will people just not really get involved? It'll just become something that is really between, Buddhists and China, whereas the rest of the world, as in America, Russia, etc., 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 they just won't get involved in this at all. And
So there's
it,
no precedence for the
I
Chinese
know,
government to do such a thing. I can only tell you how it's done
yeah,
in the Buddhist way, and in the Buddhist way, um, students and masters that are close to the Dalai Lama are in charge of finding him after he passes, and they do it through visions and things like that. The Chinese government clearly are just going to put a puppet ruler in place to control the people around him. Now, who will believe that that's the next Dalai Lama? The Chinese have a lot of influence politically over the minds of its people.
yeah.
Look at how they vilify the Dalai Lama himself. So it's just a question. I think what will happen ultimately is that it'll just ruin the authenticness of the whole process, and no one will believe either side, or more than anything, they'll just discount the whole thing, and the whole thing would just go away to the history books. The Dalai Lama also recognizes that, and often has said he thinks maybe that's a better thing to happen.
That's what I think. That's the worry as well. I mean, yeah, I'm a secular Buddhist, but I do like some of the history and such like, and I
Isn't
think
it
that's
kind of like the king and queen, like in England? Like at some
Mhm.
point, it becomes kind of irrelevant. They turn power over to the government, and then they're just there symbolically. You know, Dalai Lama right now isn't running the government in exile, and then at some point, enough controversy comes in, and people could just completely do away with the royal family. So we have it in different
Yeah.
aspects of
It-
society,
it-
don't we?
It's very much like that here. The religious archbishops, etc., etc., the
Yeah.
landowners, the wealthy, the well-to-do people, the royalty. We just dismiss them now.
So maybe on the positive side, the idea is that great practitioners will always be respected.
Yeah.
All right? Great practitioners that do the work and prove themselves and show that they can benefit others. That's not something that you have to be born into. A lot of Tibetans, masters, really have this problem of the whole reincarnation system. It really, in a lot of ways, turned into a form of corruption. The Dalai Lama in public teachings, I think, said something like he thinks most of the reincarnations aren't real. And the fact is that it was used to consolidate power. Rich, powerful people just seemed all their children were reincarnated masters, and then when you're born into that, you're automatically born into that power. You automatically inherit power and status and wealth, because that monastery that you were supposed to be the master of in the last one, it's your monastery. So in a lot of ways, I think it was really used to hurt a lot of people. Great corruption in it. So the Dalai Lama often talks about maybe it's time just to do away with it. Of course, with SBT, that's what the direction we're in. We don't believe in religious authority, right? We don't buy into any of that. We respect strong practitioners that are generous and help others.
As a way to say it, it just seems to be as he's getting older, he's embracing secularism a bit more than maybe he's able to say. But just
He's
the way
been he's been doing it for quite a while.
he has.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, Padma, please.
I was just going to ask, when the Dalai Lama says, oh, by the way, he did make a statement saying that only his office would appoint the next Dalai Lama, and no one is to recognise self-appointed Dalai Lama, just for the record.
Of course not.
Well, I was just going to say, and I always find it quite amusing when he says things that he says, oh, I might come back as a woman, or I might come back from a completely different country. And I always find it quite amusing. But then I do wonder, is he wrestling with the Chinese government, or is he actually being a rebel?
Maybe a little of both. Traditionally, great masters are supposedly able to choose the conditions of the rebirth. Pick their parents, pick their locations, all of those things. So. Quite fascinating. So, away from the Dalai Lama and more into modern Tibetan Buddhism. So, Tibetan Buddhism, when the Tibetans came out of Tibet, it took over the world like I don't think like the world has ever seen. Nowhere has Buddhism spread like that, and of course, a lot of it has to do with technology, social media, but a lot of it has to do with the Dalai Lama himself. And I remember in just a handful of short years, maybe 10 years, from being an obscure religion that people didn't really even know about, all of a sudden there were Dharma centers in every state of America, in every country of the world. Strange South American countries you never heard before, they have a Dharma center. Just extraordinary the way Tibetan Buddhism took over the world. Zen, very slow moving through its history. Theravada, very slow. Pure Land, very slow. But boy, Tibetan Buddhism just rocked the world. The color, the grandeur, just people loved it, right? And so that was quite remarkable. And but nowadays it seems to be slowing down. When I go about and I talk to Uber drivers and things, I'm surprised how many people don't know who the Dalai Lama is now. He went from like one of the most photographed people in the world, voted the greatest spiritual leader many years in a row, and all of a sudden people are starting to forget who he was. Kind of sad. But I hold my place, my education, my experience in Tibetan Buddhism is priceless. It shaped me. I think it's an absolutely beautiful path. I just, with secular Buddhism, it was just more of my thinking, more rational, more logical. Stepping away from the stories, stepping away from the mysticism. I wanted to ground myself in what I really knew worked. And then more than anything, I found what seemed to work for me the best. When I was in the monasteries and looking at all my fellow monastics, and especially the very academic approach that my monastery was, it just seemed to create a lot of afflictions instead of getting rid of them, where people became very competitive. People were very much wanted to be known for being wise and academics and scholars. And I always thought that that was kind of the opposite direction, that we wanted to lose that ego, that we wanted to awaken from all of those afflictions. So, yeah, I prefer secular Buddhism. Oh man, I'm spent. I'm out of it. I don't have anything else to share with you. But I have a zillion stories of traveling in Tibet, and there's just some great stuff. It's an amazing tradition. Yeah. Okay, hey, with that said, why don't we wind up today's class? I hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun for me as well. We have one more class before the New Year, and next week we're going to be learning about Eastern Buddhism, which includes Zen, Chan, Song Buddhism from Korea, China, and Japan. That's a fascinating thing. We're going to be learning about Pure Land Buddhism as well. And then we're going to take a break, because at the new year we're going to switch over to our Skillful Living program, which is my favorite to share. It is a life-changing program. I think everybody here has probably gone through it before. So anyways, hope everybody can make it. With that said, next Sunday we have our monthly retreat, which will be at our regular time with our regular class. The Thursday following that is New Year's Day, which we celebrate Losar, which is the Tibetan New Year's, on New Year's Day. And it's going to be simple. We're going to have at 1800 UTC, we're going to have a meditation like we always do. We're going to follow that with a Losar address that I'll share a little bit about. And then we're going to have a lively Sangha chat. We're going to all have some beverages and some snacks, all online, and just party a little bit. It'll be our party for Losar. And Losar is about putting 2025 away, getting all of our work done so we can start 2026 clean and fresh. So I hope everybody's doing that. And it was lovely sharing all this with you. Why don't we end today's class with our altruistic affirmation? May all be healthy. May all be prosperous. May all be well. May all be present, free of past regret and future worry. May all abide in constant appreciation, which is a source of great joy and contentment. May all realize their true nature and the true nature of reality, which is awakening. Thanks for joining me, friends. It was fun. I hope you liked it. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Anytime.